Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Ryan Burrows, Executive Director of the American Kratom Association. This is a very exciting time as we have filed the Federal Kratom Consumer Protection Act in both the House and the Senate. We've invited you to participate in this continuation of our federal advocacy training sessions, so you have all of the necessary knowledge and tools to help get the federal KCPA passed into law. Joining us this evening is Mac Haddo, Senior Fellow on Public Policy for the American Kratom Association. By video, we will hear from Jim Carroll, the former director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy, as well as Matt Salmon, former United States Representative of Arizona, as well as the chairman of the American Kratom Association. The Q&A will also be open for this training, and to get this underway, allow me to introduce Mac Haddo.
Thank you, Ryan, and thanks to everyone who's joining us both on Facebook and other social media platforms and on this webinar directly. It was just a few years ago, actually 7, I think, when late in the afternoon of August the 30th of 2016, I received a phone call from the American Kratom Association informing me that the Food and Drug Administration had successfully convinced the Drug Enforcement Administration to publish its Federal Register notice, providing notice that the DEA intended, using the emergency power section of the Controlled Substance Act, to schedule kratom. And that would have scheduled kratom for a 2-year period, after which they would then have the ability to schedule it permanently because they were using a little bit of a trick, using this emergency power section to ram through a scheduling decision without there being any review period. And certainly it was there were no public comments or anything involved in it that would have allowed for the kratom community to speak out. I frankly told the AKA that it was impossible to get the Federal Register notice withdrawn, but what they could do is prepare for that during that 2-year period where it would be scheduled for it to be appealed at that point. I was wrong, because what I didn't know was the strength of this community. And we today are on the precipice of an opportunity to do something that we did on a temporary basis back in 2016, and that is to stop the FDA cold. Now, I say that on a temporary basis because we know that in 2016, following more than 6,000 phone calls to the DEA, which their public affairs assistant administrator told us was the most they'd ever received on the proposed scheduling of any substance, and despite the 146,000 people that signed the petition on the White House website called We the People, and the numerous inquiries were made by members of Congress, including a letter of 51 members of the House, 25 Democrats, 26 Republicans, led by Congressman Matt Salmon as a very conservative Republican, and Mark Pocan, a very liberal Democrat, joining together. And on the Senate side, you had such diverse voices as then Senator Orrin Hatch, one of the most conservative Republicans, and Senator Bernie Sanders, inarguably one of the most liberal members, joining in their voices to tell the DEA that the FDA was wrong. We needed a check on the FDA, and the DEA delivered it in an unprecedented fashion. They withdrew the recommended scheduling, never been done before for an emergency scheduling request in 80 previous attempts, and they told the FDA, show us the proof. In 2017, the FDA did provide what's called a full 8-factor analysis. And following the evaluation of that particular 8-factor analysis by the Assistant Secretary for Health, and there was a little transition period where the acting Assistant Secretary, prior to the Senate confirmation of Dr. Jawab, actually approved the FDA's request for scheduling and sent it over to the Drug Enforcement Administration. We desperately needed a check on the FDA, and it came through in the form of a last-minute withdrawal orchestrated by Jim Carroll over at the Office of National Drug Control Policy, the White House drug czar, along with the Assistant Secretary for Health, Brett Jawab, which involved Dr. Jawab literally going to National Airport in Washington, D.C., and pulling the DEA administrator out of line to get on a plane, brought him into a conference room and informed him and delivered the letter that said that he was officially withdrawing the FDA's recommendation for scheduling of kratom. A check was needed, and it was delivered. That was an extraordinary moment in our battle as we went forward. And all of us know that the FDA, undeterred, went to the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs in 2021, and they tried the very same thing. The evidence and data, which Dr. Giroir had characterized as embarrassingly poor evidence and data and an utter failure to consider the overall public health, was then presented to 12 independent experts from around the world, the Expert Committee on Drug Dependence, who unanimously determined the FDA provided insufficient evidence. We needed a check at the international level, and they delivered. Today, we have the opportunity to do the same thing. The filing of the Federal Kratom Consumer Protection Act will deliver the final check that is needed in order to rein in the FDA's war on kratom. It will force the FDA to act responsibly. They will have to provide appropriate regulations that are consistent with the same regulations used to apply to botanical and dietary supplements and for dietary ingredients, without the procedure that they're currently hiding behind, which is called the new drug, the new dietary ingredient notification process, over which they have complete and arbitrary control as the judge, the jury, and the executioner. They will never approve an NDIN because of their bias, and that's clearly what it is. The Federal Kratom Consumer Protection Act will deliver that check. It will also remove from the FDA their arbitrary and abusive imposition of import alerts, which were never intended to block a substance because the FDA doesn't like it or the FDA can't get it scheduled, so therefore they use the scheme and artifice of creating an import alert. It'll block them from doing so. And it also will require the FDA to be transparent so that they will have to publish scientific articles, testimony of scientists and experts, the testimonies of kratom consumers. So no longer can the FDA sit and hide behind their own website and say, this is what the facts about kratom are, and mislead everyone in the information chain that they control with their bully pulpit. People like the Mayo Clinic, who themselves have never done any independent research into kratom, but only follow the party line by the FDA. People like the Cleveland Clinic, the same thing. WebMD, it goes down the line. I talk to legislators around the country and they say, oh, well, the FDA says, and then they repeat what the FDA characterizes kratom as a dangerous substance. And it's interesting, the FDA hides behind the nuances of the law. Here's an example. They will tell everyone there is no approved medical use for kratom. That's true, because kratom is not a new drug. It has not gone through the new drug application process, which is reserved for powerful chemical formulations of drugs that are formulated for the purpose of having powerful effects. And there's no way that a kratom product has done that. You can stand at GNC store and look around at the hundreds and hundreds of products that are on the shelves of a GNC store, and none of them has been approved by the FDA for an approved medical use, because they are by definition dietary supplements, or their vitamins, or their botanical supplements, or their dietary ingredient products. The FDA lies routinely to the American people. And so our opportunity is to provide another check, and that is through legislation that parallels what happened in 1994, when the FDA was just as much off the rails then about dietary supplements and vitamins. They claimed that those products at the time were killing people, that they were poorly formulated, that there were huge numbers of adverse events, and that justified the FDA imposing a requirement that all dietary supplements and vitamins would have to be subjected to the new drug approval process. They know the outcome of that. In order to wait 5 to 10 years and spend $3 to $5 billion in order to get a product approved that they know could not be sustained by sales in the marketplace. Today, the dietary supplement industry, which the FDA wants to repeal, the DSHEA Act that enables the marketing of those products, is more than a $100 billion industry in America. 80% of the American people claim that they use these products to maintain their health and well-being, all of which would be stripped from them if the FDA were to get their way. The Congress enacted the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act in 1994 unanimously because they heard from constituents about the FDA's overreach. And that's our ability today to rally as we have never rallied before. In 2016, we had a grassroots effort that was significant in that every kratom advocate spread the word about the abuses of the FDA. The FDA heard from people that were not necessarily dietary supplement consumers, but people who believed that the FDA was abusing its authority, overreaching in their regulatory authorities that were granted by the Congress. We have to replicate that today. There are people who are listening in today, as we said, and they are our anti-kratom critics. There was a news report that was published by a newspaper reporter just in the last couple of days from one of our earlier webinars, where he observed and in essence distorted what we said on those calls, because he believes, and he's terribly biased, because he believes that a nephew of his actually died from an overdose that his family attributes to being from kratom. And that has spawned this trial attorney cottage industry where they're going after kratom, and they're publicizing in every avenue possible that if you have ever taken kratom and suffered an adverse event, if you have ever heard about kratom, if you've ever thought you should use kratom, call us and we're going to sue someone. Those trial attorneys, and if that particular journalists were doing their job, they would identify the true culprit here, which is the Food and Drug Administration, who has a duty, a statutory duty, in order to protect the American public by removing products from the marketplace that are adulterated. And we know, based on science, that the vast majority of the reports of deaths that are associated with kratom all involved other substances, and many of which were adulterated kratom products in order to spike the effects of them. Some of them are just simple errors by the individuals that are taking them, where they're taking dangerous substances and that they happened at the same time be taking kratom. I can tell you that we have examples of where medical examiners and coroners themselves have reported that the FDA had jawboned them, bullied them, in order to say that a death by which the decedent had taken a kratom product but died from something completely different, that they were told to switch their analysis and conclusion in that particular autopsy. We had one a coroner from the state of Idaho call us and tell us that the FDA literally called him up after he had made a cause of death assessment of a young man who had died of hypothermia because he had used kratom. He had other drugs in his system, including a high level of alcohol, which obviously led to him passing out and dropping into a ditch in the middle of winter and dying of hypothermia. And the FDA told that coroner that he should in fact call that a kratom death. And when he questioned that and said, why would I do that? They said, because he had kratom in the system and we need to highlight this problem about kratom. The FDA is cooking the books and they shouldn't be allowed to do that. And yet today they dupe people into thinking this. None of us can imagine the tragedy of losing someone, and particularly in this environment where the second only to COVID, the major public health crisis in America today are overdose deaths. But in the 107,000 overdose deaths that occurred last year, none of them were listed as being attributable to kratom, not a single one. I'm all for a trial attorney making a living if they go after the right party where there truly is a problem. And if they truly were looking for the problem, they'd be suing the FDA. That's what they should be doing, because the FDA today does nothing about regulating products that are out there that are potentially dangerous, truly dangerous, because they're adulterated. Or, and here's the best example of all, the FDA complains that people that are consuming kratom are doing so in order to self-medicate, and they don't want that to happen. And yet, the American Kratom Association has referred almost 80 companies over the last 3 years who market their products using illegal therapeutic claims that are barred by the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And every one of those referrals has included documented evidence, the kind of evidence that should be prosecuted to remove those products from the market. In those 3 years, almost 80 referrals, and if the the reporters listening today report that, not a single prosecution, not one, no effort to take those products off the market that the FDA should be aggressively doing. But they want to have the argument that FDA is somehow bad because people are self-medicating, that kratom is somehow bad because trial attorneys are filing lawsuits, that the FDA encourages with the medical examiners to make those claims that it was a kratom-associated death. It is an abuse of the power of the FDA, and they need a check to be put on them, which the Federal Kratom Consumer Protection Act will do. The champions are ready to hear from you, the champions in the US Congress. And we need to rally the grassroots movement and tell the truth. Not the voices of those with the self-interest, not those that are funded by the trial attorneys, not those that are biased because they happen to hold a belief, however wrong it may be, but the truth. And the truth is found with the National Institute on Drug Abuse. The truth is found with independent experts that have analyzed and researched this problem and looked at whether or not kratom is in fact the cause of death, and they've come up with no known toxic level. We will not stop the FDA until the Congress steps in and enacts responsible regulations. If there are bad kratom products on the market, they need to be removed. And the FDA can do it with new statutory authorities. We need to stop the FDA from abusing their import alert authority. We need to make sure the FDA tells the truth on its website so that public policymakers around the country aren't misled by their biased opinions about kratom, because the laws aren't supposed to be based on opinions. They're supposed to be based on evidence and data. That same evidence and data that Dr. Joie said the FDA was guilty of publishing embarrassingly poor evidence and data, which has been rebutted by both the DEA, HHS, by NIDA, by the US Congress, and by the Expert Committee on Drug Dependence. Time has come for us to rise up, pull our bootstraps up in our grassroots advocacy, and let's get everybody involved in helping to actually convince a number of co-sponsors to join this legislation to help move it through. You're going to receive training tonight they'll show you exactly how you can effectively tell members of your congressional delegations how important it is that they join as co-sponsors on the Kratom Consumer Protection Act to enact a protective regulatory framework that will actually save lives. And instead of the benign neglect by the FDA, we're going to replace that with good regulations. So Ryan, I'll turn it back to you and look forward to this training and be glad to answer any questions at the end of the call. You're on mute, Ryan.
Great, thank you, Mac. And it is now my pleasure. I'll introduce Jim Carroll, the former director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy.
This is Jim Carroll, and it's nice to be with everyone this evening. I think the first question is probably, what is the role of the director of the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy? I had the distinct honor in a town that's rather broken, being unanimously confirmed as the U.S. drug czar. And in that capacity, I managed the staff of about 100 professionals at the White House to both set drug policy for the U.S. government, as well as oversee the $38 billion that Congress appropriates for this issue. And so that gave me oversight and control of 17 federal departments and agencies working to help save lives. And that's really the bottom line, that are lost to drug addiction and drug poisonings. Right now, as everyone knows on this call, we're losing about 110 to 112,000 people in the past 12 months from drugs. That's someone passing away every 5 minutes, a major airliner going down every single day. It's losing more people in the past 12 months than we lost in the entire Vietnam War. Sadly, the story goes on and on. I came to my role, and I will admit, I started my career as a criminal prosecutor, primarily prosecuting drug cases. And my life turned around, our family's life turned around when one of our children became addicted, dependent chemically, and I do want to use the word chemically here, to an opioid, started with a prescription. And again, most of you know that story of how that starts out. I'm incredibly blessed. My daughter is incredibly blessed. She came to us for help. We were able to get her into detox, and we're now 6 years into sobriety. She's married and living a wonderful life. Sadly, we know not everyone has that. And I use the term chemical very with emphasis. And I think it's important to note that there's still a great deal of stigma in this country about people who are suffering from addiction. The person that is really considered the grandfather of all U.S. drug czars is a gentleman named Robert DuPont, and he wrote a book in 2018 and gave it to me. And as you might be able to see, the title is Chemical Slavery. And I think that's really what we're talking about here today, is that in this country, with millions of people who are suffering from an addiction of a variety of sources, whether it's alcoholism, opioids, other drugs, what doctors are commonly doing are turning from one chemical to another. And that really is the premise of Dr. DuPont's book, that these people are slaves to a chemical. What we think is important here is showing that there's actually a botanical, natural, non-chemical, if you will, way to treat. In this case, what I'll say is my main role is protecting kratom for people who are using it successfully to get off a drug to which they are dependent, whether it's opioids or something else. They are able to get away from that slavery to a chemical by using kratom to be able to successfully manage their conditions, wean themselves off, and not suffer the consequences of going through detox. I can tell you, watching your own child go through detox, getting violently sick, for days on end, being in a state of hallucinations, it's brutal just to watch it. And I can't imagine going through it. And so what we need to do is to make sure that people have an alternative, that there is something that is proven to be able to help. And really what is important is to make sure that we can continue the research to further show of the great potential benefits. Mac mentioned what my friend Dr. Brett Joie said when I was the U.S. Drug Czar, when he was the Assistant Secretary for Health setting policy at HHS, which is this shows amazing potential to help people. And he also said, and something that I spoke with him personally about as we were looking at this issue, that this really has the potential to be a game changer, despite notwithstanding what FDA was telling me at the White House about kratom, because what they were telling me is this is a dangerous product. I say this half in jest, because the way that it was presented to me was almost, if you look at kratom the wrong way, you're going to overdose, you're going to die from it. And they went through these stories of people who had died from it without telling the entire story. I know I was there. I was also there when the FDA moved from me to the DEA administrator at that point with the same half of a story about kratom and not the complete story. Thankfully, we had a medical professional, Dr. Brett Joie, who was able to set us straight, make sure that we did not impose a ban on kratom because a physician who has experienced these matters knew the potential. So the DEA administrator, myself, took the recommendation of independent medical researchers, a physician, the Assistant Secretary for Health, and did not allow the half a story that we got from the FDA to cut off a real sense of hope for these people that are suffering from the disease of addiction. And I think this is where stigma comes into play. We're getting better in this country, but sadly, we know it still exists. There is a stigma against people suffering from the disease of addiction, that they have a moral failure, that they can't be trusted, that they're going to do something just inherently wrong. What we know is that that's a lie. And that's the biggest lie I think that we hear. We know recovery is possible. I know it in my own family by the grace of God. And so do other families, and so do other individuals who have successfully used kratom to get away from a chemical. In this case, and the important and lethal drug of fentanyl. This is why kratom and other substances, natural substances, botanicals, are more important than ever before. With fentanyl being so powerful and so lethal, every relapse from a recovery carries with it an increased chance of a fatal overdose, The drugs out there are so lethal that we have to make sure that we not only make recovery possible, that we make it successful. And so on behalf of the parents, on behalf of the individuals that are suffering from the disease of addiction, what the American Kratom Association is trying to do through the Kratom Consumer Protection Act is make sure that the kratom that is available is safe, that it's unadulterated, that it doesn't have other dangerous substances added to it, and that research is easy to continue to make sure that we're providing a solution. And so I'm happy to be with you all this evening. I hope we're able to answer all your questions and be able to really successfully launch a campaign of talking about why, you know, a war on kratom will not work and how we will wind up harming hundreds of thousands, quite frankly, if not millions of people. So Ryan, thank you for letting me join you tonight.
And for our final speaker, it is now my pleasure to introduce former United States Representative of Arizona, as well as the chairman for the American Kratom Association, Matt Salmon.
It's great to be with you here tonight. First of all, my first exposure to the kratom issue was back in, I believe it was in 2015. And then I introduced, actually we wrote a letter, several of us from the House. I think there were probably about 50 some of us that on both sides of the aisle. You had on the Senate side, everybody from Orrin Hatch to Bernie Sanders. So it covered the whole political spectrum, but we had a pretty impactful letter that we sent to the DEA asking them not to schedule kratom because the science didn't bear it out. And I'm proud to say that DEA during that time did not schedule kratom. So advocacy does work. I didn't know anything about kratom until 2015. And I've always had a real special place in my heart for supplements. In fact, I think they're a very, very valuable part of my life, my personal life. And I put kratom in this category. But as we go forward, you've heard from both of these gentlemen that the bill has been introduced. The goal is to protect kratom consumers. How I know that the FDA isn't serious about protecting the consumers is that we have given them dozens of companies that have violated, we believe, their sacred trust by marketing kratom with adulterated substances and also making claims that just shouldn't be made. And so, and the FDA didn't do a darn thing about it. They haven't even looked into any of these that we referred to them. So they're not serious about it. As I learned as a member of Congress for 10 years, most of these fights are about turf. Somebody doesn't want somebody else getting into their space. And they have friends in high places. And also I learned an adage early on in the process that in public policy, you either act or you're acted upon. And so this is an opportunity for us to belly up to the bar and try to influence those policymakers in a good way to protect not just the consumers, but the industry. And so let me just throw some ideas at you because you're going to hear later about this great website that you're going to have access to that's going to make it incredibly simple for you to communicate with either your representatives or your senators from your state. And number one, encourage them to come on as a co-sponsor of the KCPA. Number two, if they don't come on as a co-sponsor, to vote for the bill. And the reasons I believe that are most effective in getting public policy makers to support these kinds of ideas are, number one, talk about, and first and foremost, don't be negative. Don't make threats. Don't say negative things. Talk about the positive impacts that kratom has had in your life, the positive impacts that it's had with loved ones. And also, if you happen to be a vendor or know a vendor that is selling kratom, talk about the economic impacts in that congressional district or in that state if you're communicating with your senators. But let me tell you that when actual constituents, people that are voters in my district, communicated to me on an issue, it was about 20 times more taken seriously than if just, on a national level, people started calling your office on an issue. If these are voters that are my voters that are communicating, I think that the way it was explained to me is that for every one person you hear from, there's probably about 20 or 30 people out there that care about this issue. And so I would ask you to go onto the website that's going to be talked about just a little bit later and find an easy way. You can have it directly call your representative, and there'll be talking points that will be given you on that website, or you can email your representative or your state or your U.S. senator. And those are both really valuable ways to do this. But I encourage you to not only do it yourself, but get this message out to your family, to your friends. We want a tsunami wave to hit Congress, to let them know how important this is out there in their communities. Because believe me, everybody thinks that it's campaign cash that elected representatives and senators care the most about. That's not true. The thing they care most about are votes. If they want to come back and serve again, they care about votes. And when you speak loudly in a positive way, encouraging them to become co-sponsors of the KCPA, or at the very least to vote for it, and to communicate back with you. Ask them to communicate back with you what their position is. Don't just ask them to do it. Ask them to communicate back with you so that there's some accountability there. So we're so appreciative. We know that this effort is going to make a difference. In every state that we've passed the KCPA at the state legislatures, it's been incredibly supportive. In my own state, it was almost unanimous in both houses, and the governor signed it pretty readily. That's because we got people to come out and speak. They actually came to the committee hearings and testified at the committee hearings. Now, you're not going to get the opportunity to do that at the federal level, but this is easy stuff, folks. Easy stuff. We've made it really easy for you to get engaged and to communicate, and you need to get that out to as many people as you can. So thank you for participating, and we're glad that you're in the fight with us, and please engage and be positive and ask for a return message as far as what they're going to do with it. Thank you.
May I follow up real quick with just one point to the folks? We so appreciate you reaching out. When you call, don't be discouraged if you don't get the member of Congress on the phone.
Right.
It might be a quick phone call. You might, just be calling, giving your name, where you live, and say this is an issue that's important for me. And the staffer for the member of Congress might just say, "Okay, thank you for calling. We'll write this down," and hang up quickly. And you think, "Okay, well that's going nowhere." I promise you, it's not that they're keeping score. You tell them that, but they're keeping score. They're finding out exactly how many people are calling in. And so while you might not get a lot of information in your first phone call, the importance is they hear from you, because I promise you, they're keeping score because their boss wants to know how many people are calling in on this issue.
And if 100 people call into a congressman's office, believe me, they're gonna notice, and they're gonna do something about it. It will make a difference. And Jim's exactly right. You probably won't get the congressman. I know that they get lots and lots of calls, but Jim is absolutely right. They are keeping score, and your comments absolutely matter. Get as many people as you can to help you.
Well, that's excellent. Some really great advice from Mac, Jim, and Matt this evening. And what I will show you now is the website that was referenced. If you go to protectkratom.org/KCPA, that will bring you here to this site. And it's in one form. You can call and email at the same time. And this is the Senate and House bill numbers listed here. And when you come down to this section, you'll fill in your information. And when you put in your address, and your zip code. In this area below the checkbox, it's going to populate photos and phone numbers of your representatives and senators. You then will put in your phone number, and you're going to get a call back. And when you click Take Action in this section, you're going to get a call back from my office line that will direct you to each of your representatives and senators' offices. And that's where we want to, again, make this very simple. You'll call, you're going to tell your story, and we ask you that you also ask them to be a co-sponsor, which we've referenced in the training, but really focus on your story. We do not want you to have to worry about getting stuck on the science, the legislative history. That'll be for us, and I'll show you a form where you can share with us who you've called so that we can follow up with them and get into those details. But again, all we're asking is for you to focus on your story, try to get them to be a co-sponsor, refer to kratomanswers.org. And when you do come into this section, I'll just go ahead and read it for you. But when you call, you will either get a voicemail or an office secretary will answer the phone. If someone answers first, ask to speak directly to the representative staffer that deals with FDA matters. There's a chance you could talk to them that day. If they are available, you will take their call and share your Kratom story. If they're not available, ask for an email address. I'm a constituent and want to contact your representative. Could you please provide me the email to reach them or their legislative staffer who handles FDA matters? And if you get a voicemail, you'll say the same message, but leave your name and phone number. And when you come further down on the same exact form, you'll fill in your information again, and it will automatically populate and send your email, again, with your story, and ask them to be a co-sponsor and direct them to kratomanswers.org. And you'll type your story, your personalized message in this section, and you'll then click Take Action, and that will automatically be sent out. The follow-up is once you've done those things, we ask that you come to protectkratom.org/fedkcpa. That's protectkratom.org/fedkcpa. And this is the follow-up form. And similar to the previous form, you'll fill in your information, and then we ask, who did you speak with? And then give us some details about how the meeting went and any specifics that you think would be important for us to touch base with those staffers or representatives or senators regarding. And you can, this is an open form, you can fill in as much information or detail as you can there. And once you click submit, that'll come to our offices and we'll follow up with that accordingly. So again, those two very simple forms. We really appreciate your time filling these out. Questions can be directed to ryan@americankratom.org. And our Q&A is open, and Mac is back on as well. So we'll take our questions and our closing comments as well.
And while people, if they have any questions, are formulating those, I would just add that how important it is to do exactly what former Congressman Salmon advised, and as well as the experience from Jim Carroll, who ran the Office of National Drug Control Policy, which is to speak in respectful ways. You don't have to be negative. You don't have to be in any way critical of anyone. Just tell your story. That's the important thing, because our success around the country with those bills that we passed are because people have told their stories from their hearts. And I can tell you it makes a huge difference to your elected representatives, because as Congressman Salmon said, these people are interested in votes and they want to hear your voice along the way. So I strongly encourage you to do so. And I would also add this, the bully pulpit that the FDA has seized and stripped the American people of the right to have their voices heard, because they don't have anything on their website about your voice. Really, it has to be addressed in this fashion, where we speak up, we speak out, we use this opportunity to convey the right public policy along the way. And everyone that's in that disinformation chain, which is the head of the snake is the FDA, which includes now these reporters. I can tell you that the battle's going to get worse for us. The FDA has already started to more aggressively regulate and to try to ban kratom. They're in the process of doing that now. They are initiating bans by Facebook, or I'm sorry, by website pages. Look at their FDA and kratom website page, and you will see them make an affirmative statement that kratom is not legal to be sold in any form in the United States. They cannot do that without a rulemaking process that involves comments. But they think they can get away with it because no one's sitting on them and providing that check that should be provided. And they're out actually telling individual vendors the same thing. They can't do that. They told the governor of Missouri when he vetoed the KCPA, which had passed overwhelmingly in the legislature, the governor's veto message repeats that the FDA told him that kratom was illegal for sale. That simply isn't true. It's a lie. And yet the FDA got away with it because, again, there wasn't a check. That's why this legislation is so important. And now we hear and can expect that the media, and you've already seen the drumbeat start with the Courthouse News so-called investigative reports. Those are biased opinion pieces, and shame on the editors of that publication to allow for that kind of biased, completely uninformed kind of reporting to be done that cloaks itself in some truth, but then bears out the bias that the author has because he believes that his nephew died of a kratom overdose. I understand that, but that doesn't give him license to go on a crusade that is based only upon opinion and not upon facts. And we have always advocated at the AKA, and I know our community agrees, that we should let science dictate these kinds of policy decisions. And clearly, if there were a basis for the science to be used to justify scheduling under the Controlled Substances Act, kratom would be scheduled because all of the power the FDA has, they would be able to apply it. And if there were legitimate cases where these deaths were in fact occurring, they would be using them. And yet when every investigation was made of every death that's recorded, instead of evaluating that data the way that the Assistant Secretary for Health did, the way the Drug Enforcement Administration did, the way NIDA does, and the way the Expert Committee on Drug Dependence did, instead of using that criteria, you have a demonization of the independent experts that look at it. Read the articles, and they talk about how flawed it was that the forensic toxicologist, Jane Babin, who looked at the deaths that were advanced by the FDA, and any objective observer, as Dr. Joie was, that looked at those claimed deaths that the FDA claimed were kratom attributed to kratom, including the 44 deaths that they published in the Federal Register notice. When we issued a Freedom Information Act for those deaths, we had them evaluated. And I don't care who looked at them, there never was a credible expert that said those are justified. And in fact, we only got 43 of them. Many of you know this story. 43 of the autopsies that were provided by the FDA. And in every case, they could not draw a connection to kratom being the sole cause of the death of any of those individuals. And most of them were so ridiculously bogus, it wasn't even funny. No credible science backing it up. But to give you an idea of how biased the agency is, and I would love to hear this reporter justify this, we finally got the 44th death autopsy. Now, we had known the date of the death and the actual date and I think the last name of the individual, but it was a reporter from another newspaper who discovered the actual autopsy, which the FDA had claimed we were barred from getting because the family had imposed a HIPAA restriction on it, which is a privacy law, which everyone has to respect. That turned out not to be true. The FDA just didn't want to give us that particular autopsy, and we now know why. Because that autopsy revealed that the cause of death for that individual were 2 gunshot wounds to the chest. The young man had been involved in a drug sting. The young man who was shot by the police refused to get out of the car after he was ordered to do so. He went for what the police thought was a weapon, and he was shot after ignoring multiple requests by the police to do it. And when they did the tox screen, they found that he had ingested a number of drugs and that he had drunk a low level of kratom tea that day. So it showed on the tox screen. So what conclusion did the FDA make? They said that was a kratom-caused death. That's not even reasonable, but that's the way the FDA plays. And that's the way they're doing business today. And it is empowered by irresponsible journalists who are so biased that they can't see straight on these kinds of things. And that's why we have to provide the check on the FDA and the check on all of the sycophants that follow the FDA blindly without examining with common sense, if nothing else, the standard by which we should be judging the addiction liability and the safety profile of any substance, including kratom. We have to do it fairly, and we have to do it with balls and strikes. So I think that if we leave any message with you tonight, and it looks like we've satisfied all your questions, but if we leave any message, it is to, again, replicate what we did in 2016. Get your family members. They do not have to actually be a kratom consumer. They have to have experienced the benefits that you in your life, and they have to witness that, and they can attest to it. Because we know that in many cases, struggles that people have with acute and chronic pain implicate all of our families. And if there is a solution, and kratom, as the National Institute on Drug Abuse has found, is a potential harm reduction tool that can help people that are not only suffering from these acute and chronic pain issues, but help wean them off of far more dangerous and far more addictive substances. And kratom is a solution along the way. So I think that that as a practical matter, our opportunity is before us. And as a practical and important, compelling position for us, we need to act, and act as quickly and as decisively, and with your personal story as quickly as you can. So thanks to everyone who has been engaged in this battle. We obviously have been through a lot together. This is an important time for us to get our grassroots movement back energized, and to tell the Congress that the FDA has to act responsibly going forward and protect this plant from the abusive regulatory powers of the FDA, which is today a rogue agency when it comes to the regulation of kratom. So thanks, everyone. I'll turn it back to Ryan.
Oh, thank you, Mac, and thank you all for joining us this evening. We will be following up regularly with further updates. And that's it. Thank you for your help with this, and we hope you have a great evening. Thank you.